writing. I have to admit, it's a little bit unusual for me to talk about culture. I should probably talk about scalability or how to build communities and things like this. But I've tried to present culture and why it's important from an actually technical person's perspective, which is sort of a more skeptical and cynical one as well. So I hope it resonates with you guys as well. So in this brief talk, I'm going to talk about what culture is when people talk about culture in companies, why it's important, and how you can go about fostering a good one in your company. So when people say the word culture in a corporate context, usually people think of these like motivational posters. That's what I thought. Actually, I was highly skeptical and cynical about the whole thing around culture, mission, statements, values. I thought it was just a bunch of mumbo jumbo that big companies do, or it's usually satirized in TV shows. And in fact, and for that particular reason, I really appreciate the fact that you guys have taken the time to come and listen to me, because if I were in your shoes, I would probably feel the same way, and I would certainly understand if you currently feel that way. There's a story from Polyvore in the early days when one of our investors, Michael Deering, actually came in to have a session with us around mission statements and values and our company culture. And I have to admit that if it wasn't Michael, I would have probably sat that session out, but sort of out of respect, I attended. And but the whole time I was a little bit more like, why are we doing this? We should be writing code right now. It wasn't until much later on that the importance of culture actually registered with me. It was sort of an epiphany for me. So this is not really culture. Culture is not something that you're going to buy a poster and put on your wall. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. And as I explained, in Polyvore's case, the first 2 years, we were completely heads down writing code. We didn't really pay any attention whatsoever to culture or mission or values or any of sort of those soft things. So what changed? Around year 2, we started to grow past the core team. We had been a very tightly-knit, small, awesome engineering and product team. And while we had actually some differences, more or less implicitly, we were very similar in the way that we approached everything and worked together. But as the team started to grow and we started to recruit new people into the company, weird situations. We would hire somebody who would pass our very rigorous technical interview, and then once they were inside the company and working with us, we would notice in some cases that they behaved very differently than how the rest of the team had been behaving up to that point. I can give an example of this. For example, we'd implement a search engine with product search engine, and I would notice that maybe the ranking of the search engine results could be improved. So I would go to this new person and say, like, hey, thanks for implementing the search engine, but I've noticed I think we can do a better job on the ranking. And in the past, people would have said, oh yeah, you're right, let's look into what can be done to improve the search ranking. But for some of the new people, they were like, well, why should we improve the ranking? I typed in t-shirts and I'm getting a bunch of t-shirts, it's working. Why should I bother actually improving the search results? And that was kind of a big surprise to me, because I'd never encountered that scenario before, where we actually had sort of a fundamental disagreement about what was important. I had simply assumed that everybody would care about the same kind of things that I cared about as a product and engineering person. This happened a couple of times, and we started to notice a pattern that there was something, we had made an assumption that was not actually true about everybody. And unfortunately or fortunately, while these people were really great technically, they didn't actually fit into Polyvore, and we eventually parted ways with them. But as a company, we also wanted to make sure that we don't keep repeating this mistake of essentially hiring people who were great technical fits but bad cultural fits for us. So that was the first time that actually this notion of culture as a sort of epiphany occurred to me and was crystallized. And from that point on, it has been something that we've actually put a lot of emphasis in Polyvore. So a lot of our interviews are actually, for example, in the technical interviews are highly technical plus a cultural screen. So what is culture in a company? There is actually not a definitive answer to that. I think for every company it's a little bit different. The best way that I've come to think about it is the specific way that you guys in your company go about doing things. And it can take on a lot of different dimensions. So for example, the things that actually make you happy or celebrate. For example, for some people, it might be solving a technical challenge, something that is very difficult to solve, and you have a solution for it. That is what the company values. Or for some other people, it might be very user-centric. So if you actually solve a difficult user problem, that becomes what's important. It could be the communication style and how differences are resolved. For example, you could have discussions around how to implement a certain feature, version A or version B. Are you a data-driven type of a company where you measure some metrics and you decide based on that, or is it more driven based on people's gut feelings? And if there's some disagreement, how do you resolve that? It's about other kinds of values. For example, fairness. Like, do you believe that everybody in the company should be compensated a particular way? Or are you okay if there's sort of discrepancies in the way people are compensated? So it can take on lots and lots of different dimensions. But if you examine each one of those dimensions, you'll see that there are multiple ways of going about things. And the specific way that your company goes about doing them is what essentially your culture is. So why is it important? I think all companies, at this point, most companies here are probably 3 to 4 people on average, is my guess. And probably the people that you're working with are very similar to yourselves in sort of what their beliefs are. And probably that's part of the reason that you've ended up working together. But hopefully, if you get to the next stage where you're going past 4 or 5 people to 10 people to 20 people to 100 people and hopefully beyond, chances are that what made you to get to that scale is not only your technical abilities in solving the right set of problems, but is partially your culture and how you went about solving problems. And as you scale out and the number of people grow, you want those characteristics to remain true for as long as possible within your companies. You hear a common refrain that as companies grow, they kind of lose their sense of being a startup, or the startup culture is lost. As much as possible, you want to not let that happen, because whatever made you successful to go from 4 people to 10 people to 20 people to 100 people, you want to retain that, whatever made you great, for as long as possible. And you cannot do that unless you explicitly think about what that thing is. So since I'm one of the co-founders at Polyvore, I'm going to use Polyvore as kind of a case study or talk about sort of the evolution of culture at our company. Of course, we've made a bunch of mistakes along the way as well, but I think we got a bunch of things right. So when we first started, actually I had left Yahoo, and this was in 2007. And leaving Yahoo at that time, I actually had more things on how I didn't want to do things, so sort of negative cultural attributes that I just wanted to avoid while we were creating Polyvore. Of course, things have changed dramatically now over the past year, so I'm really happy to hear that. But at that point, you'd hear a lot of people complaining about Yahoo. So when we started Polyvore, we had essentially kind of a mishmash of values or things that we cared about as a team that was starting. So, we wanted to be very scrappy, and I think that's kind of a good thing. We didn't want to frivolously spend money on things that didn't yield results for us. So we cared a lot about efficiency of things. We wanted to create high-quality products. For somebody coming from Yahoo, you can understand that Yahoo at that point got dinged a lot for not being very innovative or the products not being exceptional, especially compared to Google at that time. So one of the things that we really wanted to focus in the company was to put a lot of emphasis on high quality and polish. And this could take in the form of UI polish or search result ranking polish. It turns out that some of these attributes are things that you can apply pretty much not only to your product, but to pretty much all aspects of what you end up doing. I'll give some examples later. The other one was to be fast. And fast is probably one of the most important things. It's not only in your product that you want it to be fast, but how fast does the team work together in solving problems or converging on the right set of solutions. We generally measure this in terms of from the time that we decide something to the time that it's actually done. How fast can we make that happen? The other thing was, again, coming out of Yahoo, we wanted to be very engineering-centric because at that time we felt that, I felt that Yahoo was a technology company, but it felt that it was a media company. So technology people were not necessarily as valued as they were at Google. So for Polyvore, even though we are a fashion company, we actually go way out of our way to make it be about engineers at the center of it. So it is really a tech company applied to the fashion space. And with that comes a lot of things like automation and testing and code refactoring and always making the time to allow our engineering team to spend time on those type of things. There are some other things as well. Transparency is another great cultural practice. At Polyvore, all the teams send out daily or weekly status updates that pretty much capture everything that has happened within that team, and anybody in the company can read them and to find out what is going on within each company. This is probably one of the things that this is something that I highly recommend. It's worked really well for us. But not all companies are like that. Some companies are secretive. So there are decisions made that the rest of the company does not necessarily know about. And as you can imagine, maybe it's not an issue when you're 4 people, but when you're 50 people, there are definitely parts of the company that you are not going to know what is going on in unless there's a mechanism in place for you to be able to do that. The other thing that we put a lot of emphasis on was to create a great work environment. We knew that we were going to spend the bulk of our waking hours at Polyvore, especially at a startup, from like 8 a.m. till 2 a.m. for the first couple of years. And we went through a lot of effort to make sure that our work environment was as great as possible. So we always got modern buildings that had lots of natural light, and we didn't skimp on equipment. Everybody got great equipment, basically whatever they needed to best do their job. We had cater food, and we still do. And thank you. Yeah. So you have a fantastic view here, actually. Yeah. And another thing that we did, for example, was to get lots and lots of plants. For example, like we have hundreds of plants in our office just to make the environment a little bit nicer. But basically, we wanted to create a great work environment because we believe that we want great people to want to work at our office. And we felt that the company's stance should be that to do whatever it can to create the best environment for those great people. The other sort of guiding principle or cultural principle for us was that we always put our users first. So plenty of times we had opportunities to take a shortcut to monetization, for example, but we felt that it would actually be harmful to our user base. And we always sort of, whenever it came to one of those decisions, we chose the users first. And it's kind of a long-term strategy or cultural belief of the company, but that has really paid off well for us over the long term. So I mentioned some of our stats, but So we could have taken some shortcuts, but I think it worked out great. The other thing that we wanted to create is that even though we are an engineering-centric company, we wanted to be highly collaborative, which means that great ideas can actually come from all the different functions within the company. So we didn't want it to be only the engineers can come up with ideas or only the product manager can come up with ideas. We actually wanted to have a very flat sort of organization where anybody can have an input. So this was sort of the mishmash of lots of implicit cultural values that we had. Later on, we realized that actually one of the most important cultural values is simplicity. So, that was just way too much. So, as I mentioned, about 2 years in, we realized that we had implicitly practiced sort of a culture within Polyvore, but we hadn't really explicitly thought about it. And as we started to grow the team, we suddenly realized that it was actually very important for us in order to be able to bring in productive people into the company. So we had to sit down and sort of synthesize all of this mishmash into a more simpler set of principles that now are what Polyvore's culture are. And those are 3 things. So I think 3 is a good number if you want to simplify things too.
Sorry, I missed it. So did you throw the other ones out and you started over?
No, what we tried to do is basically take all the things. We made a huge list of the things that we cared about implicitly, and we tried to organize them into as few categories as possible. And we came up with this list.
Sorry.
Yeah, not at all. You should feel free. So the first one is do a few things well. And this really captures polish, simplicity. We kind of use Apple, which is a little bit cliche, as a sort of an example of a company that through simplicity and polish have been successful. Delight the user. That's the next thing, because Polyvore especially is a community-generated site. Without the user community, Polyvore is completely worthless. So we wanted to make sure that everybody who was coming into the company understood this. And this was sort of our filter. And then make an impact. We wanted people who, when they inherently wanted to make a difference. So we want to come to work with the intention of making a difference. So we felt that it was important enough that we actually explicitly call it out rather than implicitly assume it. So we had 3. I should also say that we really wanted to put a huge amount of emphasis on doing a few things well. So in reality, it's actually do a few things exceptionally well. So just for added emphasis. And unfortunately, speed did not make it into the list, but in retrospect, I actually wish that we had kept speed as one of the principles. I think as companies grow larger, it is that's probably one of the main things that you're going to miss, which is things happening in an afternoon of having an idea and implementing it and pushing it out live. Once you're at 50 people, that can still happen. I mean, at Polyvore, we push code multiple times a day, but just because that is a little bit rare because there are multiple people involved in the decision or the design and QA and unit testing and all sorts of things that need to happen. So you tend to miss the immediacy of like, here's an idea, it's live later in the same day. But I do think that speed is one of the things that I think if your company has speed, a lot of other things must be working correctly. So it's probably, if I was going to pick one attribute to retain, I would probably pick speed. So now that I've given you an example of Polyvore and what makes for its culture, I just wanted to talk a little bit about whatever your culture is. Once you get to the stage that it actually really matters, which is going to be hopefully very soon, once you're scaling past the initial core team, how to go about sort of making sure that it's part of the company as it grows. So the first step is codify it. So as I said, we had sort of an implicit culture in the company. And it wasn't until we actually had to sit down and write a list and put it up on our about page about like what the company's culture was and use it in our recruitment and all of these things had we gone through the process of codifying it. So that is the first step. Unless you actually sort of define it and put it down on paper, you do not really know what it is that you're trying to preserve. The next thing is to use it as a filter. So the usefulness of the culture is really, you can think of the company itself, like all the people inside of it that are deeply involved in the company as sort of the inside of the circle. And you want to use your culture as a filter that keeps out elements that you don't want inside that circle. And so this would apply to people you're going to hire into your company, but it could also extend to all sorts of other people, like the partners that you work with or the investors that you work with. You'd be surprised how cultural agreement, like people basically valuing the same set of things, enters into long-term relationships and affects them. You know, the example that I gave of people who were very technically competent would join our team, but they wouldn't actually work out, and everybody was unhappy, and we eventually had to part ways, and it was a huge waste of time for everybody. You don't want that to happen. And sometimes, you know, with somebody who's joining your company, you can, you know, after 6 months or 3 months or whatever, you can part ways, and it hurts a little bit in the short term, but you kind of get over it. But some of the other relationships, they're long term, like for 6 years or 10 years or whatever. So you have to be very careful, and don't be afraid to use your culture as a filter for deciding who you're going to work with or not. I have one other thing to say about this, which is for a long time we were actually afraid or to be upfront about our culture with people. So for example, when we were talking to potential employees, we kind of left the culture stuff in the background. We just focused on like a technical interview because we were it's really hard to hire, especially engineers. So we didn't want to scare people away and say like, you know, we have this additional criteria that we may say no to you because you don't share our culture. But after 2 or 3 hiring mistakes of hiring people and then them not working out, we realized that we should just be upfront about it. And say, you know what, like this is our culture, these are the things that we care about. If you join us, this is what it's going to be like here. And surprisingly, it actually helped us in hiring, because when we were very explicit about the things that we cared about and what the culture of the company was like, we found that it actually attracted a certain type of person to the company. So, and you know, the other nice thing was that people who were not cultural fits, you know, we managed to sort of filter them out. By the way, I have to also say another thing, which is there's an opportunity here to be sort of judgmental about culture. We were never judgmental about it. We sort of said, this is the things that we care about. I think other people are free to care about whatever they care about. The only thing is, like, if they decide to work here, they need to know that this is our culture and they're joining this kind of a team. So it was never a matter of judgment and saying, like, just because you don't share our culture, you're bad or whatever. That person most likely can find a great place for them to work, and they will get to thrive in that environment. So it's not a judgmental thing, it's just a matter of fit. The other thing about culture is that you have to view it everywhere. So it's not just about one aspect, like engineering culture. It actually manifests itself in everything that the company does. And I think here, again, another cliche example, but Apple is really a great example of this, because for Apple, for example, the attention to detail and polish is not only in the product, the hardware manifestation, the software manifestation, the physical packaging, the store experience. Everything is part of sort of the Apple culture of perfectionism, I suppose. So don't view culture as something that is just sort of one-dimensional. You should try to, most people who care about this stuff actually care about it in all sorts of dimensions. So the example I gave from Polyvore was our office space. We actually care a lot about our office environment or the food that we cater for the company, because we just think that's one other dimension of what the company is about. So the other thing is that it doesn't happen by itself. So the implicit culture that you have now in your company, for for it to actually survive or thrive or get better at 10 people and 20 people or 100 people, it takes energy like everything else. Like for your product to grow, you need to spend a lot of energy into refining it and growing it. Same with your company culture. So part of that is whenever you see it in other people, especially who are beyond the founding team, you really need to reinforce it and celebrate it and give them a pat on the back for upholding whatever cultural values that is important to you guys. And you need to intervene as needed whenever it doesn't happen. So if you let things, if you don't spend that energy, over time, like entropy will kick in and people start to veer off that track. And in those situations, you actually have to actively intervene and step in and say, you know what, like as a company, we really care about polishing our products, and this particular product does not meet our particular bar. And, you know, the reason that conversation should be quite easy to have because you have been upfront about it when you were hiring people into your company, so it should not be a surprise to people that you care about it. But it does require intervention. If you do not, if you just sort of let things go, a different type of culture will become set within the company, and at a really large scale it becomes harder and harder to turn things around and get it back on track.
Does that also apply to customers in relationships? I know you have more customer relationships to manage than employees. So that's something that I struggle with. So
yeah, maybe we can talk about that at the end. The last bit is you have to set an example as the founders. So the founders, essentially whatever behavior you have or whatever cultural attributes that you exemplify are going to be copied by everybody else in the company. So you cannot expect people who are working in the company to have a different set of cultural attributes if you're going to behave differently. So if you care about polish, you need to show that yourself. If you care about people working really hard and being scrappy, you need to exemplify that yourself. Whatever it is, you have to basically set an example for it. Otherwise, it's kind of unfair to expect other people to do that for you, and it just wouldn't work. That's the end. So, if there are any questions, I'll try my best to answer them.
Hello, my name is Alvaro. I'm from blog.com. And we are struggling right now because we have hired several interns, and some of them have to leave, and they have created this emotional connection with the team. And it's been like a year and 2 months. We are now 15 people. So how did you manage that? That sensation of, okay, some people have to leave because some new guys are coming in. I would like to know if you had experience on that.
Yeah, actually, we did go through similar situations. Because at Polyvore, we put a lot of emphasis on creating a really nice work environment. We actually have lunch together as a team every single day. And part of the reason that we put that in place was because we wanted people to interact with each other and sort of create that bond. And for whenever somebody had to leave for whatever reason, voluntarily, or things didn't work out, I felt that actually that made it a little bit difficult because you were just having lunch with this person for weeks on end, and you're really great friends, and now you're saying that, hey, things are not working out, right? I do think that having a really nice work environment, the benefits do outweigh this kind of uncomfortable situation that you may temporarily have to go through. Like having a great team, you have to operate with the assumption that most people are going to work out in your company and you want them to be very close to each other. I think that's a great cultural attribute. I think the way that we eventually dealt with this was to realize that so whenever people had to leave involuntarily, we framed it as a question of fit rather than sort of being judgmental and saying like this person sucked. We never said that. We said this person's skill set or what they want to do is not a good fit for Polyvore, and they are actually both Polyvore and this person are going to be better off in a different situation, even though there's a short-term amount of sort of pain to go through that transition. That person really deserves to be in a place that they can thrive in, because being in a place that people don't think you're necessarily doing a good job, that's that's kind of a dead end for them. So yeah.
Yeah, and I have another question, and it's regarding the team. Right now we're in 2 countries. It is a little bit difficult to maintain the culture because our culture is about learning. There are companies that provide video courses about learning about everything. So we try to make everybody learn every single day something new inside the company. So when we were in just one country, every week we had somebody that came to the office and explained us how to break dance, how to, things like we're out of the box. And now it's a little bit difficult because we have people in Chile, people here, people in Madrid, and we are doing things like online, but it's like it's not the same. Do you have any experience on managing people that are not in the same place and how to think together?
You ask all the difficult questions. So, working with remote teams can be challenging, especially once you care about sort of these softer things like culture and team bonding and their inclusion in the overall sort of sense of a company. For this reason, actually, so Polyvore does have a remote office based in New York, was primarily a sales office rather than the core engineering and product team. But even then, we actually do have this particular issue. How do we make sure that our remote office sort of is an integral part of the headquarters in Mountain View? The way we do that is there are lots of sort of tactical things that you can do that I can name. Having lots of video conferences or daily check-ins with them so that they do interact with people on both offices is one of them. The other thing we do is that we make sure that we actually visit each other. So every month or every couple of weeks, a couple of people from our side visit the New York office, and we also make sure that they come to visit us as well. But I do agree with you, it is a challenge, and I think finding specific things that are sort of team building experiences and making sure that all the different remote offices participate in them, thanks to video conferencing, for example, I think is a great step. The other thing, if possible for you guys, is to make sure to arrange things such that people can visit each other's offices and maybe spend a little bit of time so that you cross-pollinate sort of between offices and not let one office kind of veer off in its own sort of island. I'll think about more ideas for you, or maybe do a little bit of research. Yeah.
So I was wondering about the same thing that you mentioned with culture, and how to have your company culture with your customers, and how to set the boundaries.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'm not as qualified to answer that because as the sort of the technical person, I deal with our users, but not our advertisers who are our clients. But I have seen how it can manifest itself and how that's evolved for Polyvore. In the early days, we were absolutely intent on pleasing everybody. So we would, yeah. So we would do a lot of things that were totally non-scalable, just because we were so, as a new company, you're so happy to just have any clients. So in some ways, I don't want to say we were abused, but in retrospect, we did things that we should probably have not done and we should have pushed back. I think it kind of, just to answer that question, maybe it's not really related to culture, it's more about how to deal with clients, is that I do think that you need to value your own time and what you guys are about and expect other people to respect that. So it is totally fine to establish some boundaries and say no to certain things rather than, because otherwise, if you say yes to everything, the company will actually suffer in the long term. So.
Thanks, even though I veered off.
No, that's fine. It's a very valid question. Yeah.
Sort of related to culture, but how did you, what was the hardest thing about transitioning from, you know, you and your co-founders, just being you guys, to becoming, you know, I know at one point you were CEO, and to kind of more, like as the company grew, like your role as a founder changes from being probably
Or hands-on.
more hands-on,
Yeah.
and then less so. Like, what did you find was the biggest challenge in that transition?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think for most founders, like you said, you know, they're very early on, they're extremely hands-on. And as a team scales and the company scales, you hit sort of a time limit. There's no way that you can actually do everything that is needed to be done. Like, you only have so many hours. And for most people, that realization, actually, unless they have experienced it in the past, they realize that they need to start delegating kind of too late. Like, by the time you're drowning in too many things going on is when you realize, oh, I really need to be handing off. And in some ways, that's already like 6 months too late, because by the time that you actually find great people and ramp them up in your company so that they can actually offload you with something, it takes at least 6 months, or like if you're lucky, on average, right? So by the time, if you wait till the moment that you're really drowning and then you start looking for somebody to take over stuff for you, you're still looking for another 6 months before there is a relief in sight. And on top of that, you have to divert your energy to recruiting or finding the right person. They're not just going to land in your lap. So that's the first piece of advice, the piece of experience, which is like, you need to really stay ahead of sort of your own bandwidth and trying to expand it by growing the organization. The next bit, which touches culture, is you need to trust those people, that you actually really need to hand off something that you really wanted to do yourself and you don't really trust anybody else doing. Now you need to, for them to be successful and effective, you need to actually trust them and hand off the task to them. Maybe for the first few months you kind of help them out or guide them in the right direction, but eventually the goal is that they are going to do it. And I think this is probably the hardest thing for the founders to do, because that person is not going to do it the same way that you are going to do it. They're going to do it differently because they're a different person. And I think the reason the culture is really important is because at least culture provides sort of a framework for how they're going to go about doing it. So even though what they specifically do is different, at least they adhere sort of to some general parameters of how they're going to do it. So if your company values are to be scrappy, you know, hopefully they'll do it in a scrappy way. Or if it's to be very fast or be user-centric, all of those things, or to have a lot of polish, if you've talked about those things in advance, it makes the working relationships easier. But Christine, I think you pointed out some of the probably most difficult things as you know, companies who are lucky enough to get to the next stages. I think that's one of the major challenges that they have to go through. It's not easy. Yeah.
My name is Ansel, position of Frontier Data with markets. The question is, if a person on the stage in a company, about 10 people, you find out that some person doesn't buy the company's value all of a sudden. I mean, how will it be the technical, very, very good as a technical person? How easy it is to actually make this person buy the values, or is it more efficient to sort of remove this person permanently?
Yeah. You know, actually, we experienced both. So we were not, I think it's definitely worth having a conversation, or probably more than a conversation. Like, it will probably take like quite a month or two at least to sort of explain what is important to you, why maybe the way that they're doing certain things does not fit with what the rest of the team does it. So I think you should definitely give people a chance. If you can do that upfront, like at the interview stage, once you know what those things are, obviously you'll save yourself a lot of time, because you will know that upfront and people can decide whether they want to join or not. And those conversations become a lot easier. But in our case, both scenarios happened, where we had people who simply just were not aware of what was important. And it was actually our fault as a company for not having been more explicit or explaining those things to them. Because once we did, and we kind of pointed out some things, they were totally fine. Like, they said, oh, you know, I get it. Like, I'm capable of doing that, and totally worked out. But in some other cases, it was just like an impossible conversation. So we spent so much energy on I mean, in one particular instance, we have a coding style within the company, and one person just didn't want to adhere to it, and we explained, like, okay, nobody in particular, no individual agrees with the coding style exactly, but as a team, we agree that it's better that we adhere to one because we work as a team, and it's better for everybody. And this point just didn't stick, so we were like, okay, like, we tried, and it didn't work out. So my recommendation is definitely have the conversation, but I think the important thing is not to be judgmental about it and say, like, your way is bad. I think framing it as, this is the way that this company works best, and this is what we care about, and ideally being able to sort of explain why. So, for example, for us, emphasis on polish, we have a philosophy around, we want to create polished products because we think that those will do better in the marketplace. So it's not just completely pulled out of thin air, so it's easier to have that argument.
So actually you have the experience of like keeping this person in and actually converting this person to legal.
Yeah, I think if they have an open mind and they're capable of doing it, I think there's no reason why it can't work out. But, yeah.
I have a question about hiring new people.
Yeah.
Maybe questions about like, how do you involve your employees to hire new people?
Yeah.
I think that would be effective.
Yeah. Sure, that's a great question. How do we involve everybody in the hiring process? So actually, our hiring process has evolved over the years. We were very ad hoc at the beginning, and I think most companies are very ad hoc. Like, people come in for an interview, and then they just like spend an hour with a bunch of different people, and everybody has their own favorite questions, like a technical question that they ask them. When we actually had to ramp up our hiring, we found that maybe like 4 out of 5 people were basically asking more or less the same question of the candidate and over covering certain particular aspect and completely neglecting other areas of what they should be screening people for. So we have become a little bit more systematic about it now, which is we actually have a set of criteria that we want to screen or interview people for. So some of it is technical, but a lot of them are cultural. So questions like, give us examples of products that you really admire, or and explain to us what it is that you admire about them. So, for example, testing for polish, like looking for signs that people paid attention to certain things. And then we divide this amongst our team. So certain people focus on the technical questions, other people who have maybe more an eye for UI or polish or certain things focus on those type of examples. So everybody has kind of a script that they go into the interview, and it's not a complicated thing. It's just like a basic sheet of paper that says these are the 5 different areas that we care about. This one is going to be covered by Jonathan, this one's going to be Kevin, the other one is Cindy, and so on and so forth. And then in the interview process, each person makes sure that they cover that particular area, so that after the rounds of interview we have a complete picture, so there's no question of like, oh, did we forget to ask about this particular aspect or not.
Do you, another question is like, which do you prioritize, like something really good or something very
Yeah. I think different companies have different stances around it. That's another hiring challenge. In the very beginning, when you're like sub 10 or 15 people, you cannot afford any like weakness on any dimension, I think. So because the costs are just, you'll pay the price anyway. So there were times that we were absolutely desperate to hire somebody, and we lowered the bar, and we did hire somebody, and 6 months later we regretted it. So, you end up paying the price anyway. I think at the early stage, a lot of people basically focus on hiring superstars, right? Like generalist superstars that can basically deal with any problem. As the company grows, I think one thing that will happen is that you'll get more specialization. So you have different functions. So for example, at Polyvore, we have iOS developers, which are focused on just iOS. So it's a much narrower set of skills. And one thing that we did wrong, actually, was that we didn't update our hiring criteria for this narrower band. So we were still looking for superstar generalists, even for an iOS developer role, for example, right? And we found that even people who were very qualified to do that job, we are rejecting because they kind of like their back end, like database tuning skills were not up to par. So the thing to do is as your company gets bigger and you have more specialized roles to scope the role definitions so that more people can actually sort of excel in all of the required dimensions rather than all possible dimensions. Yeah. But if people are weak on the required dimensions, we usually pass. So whatever is required for the role, you have to be strong in it, because again, we found that if you compromise on that aspect, you kind of end up paying the price down the road anyway. So it's, yeah. Any other questions?
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you.